afternoon after lunch sedation does not sink in. Again, my name is Todd Stern, and I have the privilege to serve as the superintendent of Central 301. You may wonder where that's located. It's located in western Elgin, Illinois, one of the fastest growing school districts in the state. I know I look like I'm only in my 20s, but back in 1999, the same day as the school board, the meeting that I was attending, we were first looking at some of our security and safety plans. Happened to be the date of April 20th, 1999, same day as the Columbine shooting. And that shooting changed everything as we move forward and we continue to adapt and we continue to look at ways to keep our schools, our students, our staff, and our visitors safe. And the balancing act that we face is that we do not want our schools to feel like a hard, sterile place. And yet, we also know that they can't feel too soft because you can't circumvent your security. So today you're fortunate because you truly have before you at this table some industry leaders in the area of school security, also in the area of architectural design and school construction. The first presenter I'd like to introduce to you is Mr. Paul Ohm. Paul Ohm is the Senior Vice President of Operations for P4 Security Solutions, located here in Chicago. He is former Special Forces Army Ranger, and he is the former Chicago University Director of School Security and Safety. And he currently is chair of the Public and Private Committee for the Illinois Chiefs of Police. So he comes to you very credentialed as an expert in this field, as well as to his right, Chief Mike Felice. Chief Mike Felice is the former fire chief of the city of Elgin, Illinois. He is currently the fire chief of Bartlett Fire Protection District, and he is past president of the Illinois Fire Chiefs Association, and he brings with him a wealth of knowledge. He has also been a respondent at a mass casualty event. To his right, Mr. Steve Nelson. Mr. Steve Nelson is an architect with Larson & Darby, but he brings so much more to the table because, like many of you, he is also a school board member. He is the vice president of the school board for Sycamore, Illinois, and he's also the vice president and BluePoint co-founder, BluePoint Alert Solutions for School Safety. To his right is Mr. John McNutt, who works with Shales McNutt Construction and School Design and Construction, and also BluePoint Alert co-founder. Together they have a wealth of knowledge, and we're going to look at lessons learned from the Parkland shooting. And with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Paul Ohm. Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
I want to thank everybody for being here today. It's an important topic, and to have you sitting here engaged and wanting to learn about it speaks a lot, so I appreciate your time. What I will do is I will go through the Parkland. This is not very detailed. What I'm going to do is go through the timeline. I based the slides off of, if you go search online, and some of you may have seen it, you can find a video the Chicago Tribune put out, most news agencies have, that shows the timeline of the shooter entering the building and actively engaging in the building. The icons, it's with icons, it's just dots that shows the movement through the building. It could be unsettling to some people. I'm a 5-year combat veteran, deployed 5 times, and honestly to watch that and see even circles change from green to purple, it's unnerving because you know what that meant. So I'm not going to show the video, but feel free if you want to. I do have slides from the video, and I'll go through the timeline to give you an understanding of what happened, and then we'll talk about some of the things that we can do after action to mitigate some this happening in the future. So those of you who are not familiar with the campus, and by the way, has anybody sat through or has anybody done a deep dive into the shooting? Raise your any? Okay, a couple people. So this is the campus, and I don't know. I went to a pretty large high school. Only had one building though, but this is a large campus, as you can tell. There we go. So this, Building 12 is where the building actually happened. This map is oriented north to south. So it's the northernmost building on the property. And you can see how many buildings and how wide the campus is. And over here you have the football field. A lot of times you'll hear in the accounts of there was some concept or idea that shots were coming from the football field. Obviously echoes, but just so you see the proximity of the football field to where it happened. So I'll start before we get to the next slide. At 2:19 p.m., or at 2:06 p.m., Nicholas Cruz was picked up by an Uber car and asked, his route was to go to the school. He had with him a bag, a long bag, that could have been a musical instrument. We had a seminar with a panel discussion on Thursday, and in that panel was the regional security director for Uber, Mr. Billy Kuehl, who was a former Secret Service agent. And Uber's come under fire now because they're stating that the driver should have identified that this was an odd occurrence that a teenager towards the end of the school day would get in a vehicle with a long case and be asked to take into a school. Again, I mean, I don't know, you can fall on either side of that argument, but as you can see, the after-action reviews are going pretty deep to the point where the Uber driver's being called into question now as far as why he didn't identify anything out of order. He arrived at the school at 2:19. It's a half hour before roughly 3,500 students and staff are set to stream out of their high school. Obviously, it was Valentine's Day, so everybody's gearing up towards whatever events they had going on for the afternoon, and they were looking to get out shortly. He arrives on campus in a small gold-colored Uber car. Cruz is a former student of Stoneman Douglas. He was expelled for disciplinary reasons. He walks purposely toward the school's 1200 building and carries a duffel bag hiding an AR-15 rifle. At 2:21 p.m., moments before gunshots, freshman Chris McKenna steps out of his first floor English class and heads to a flight of stairs to use the restroom. There, McKenna encounters Cruz, who had gone into the building's east stairwell to load his gun. Cruz has a stark warning for the freshman: "You better get out of here, things are going to get messy." McKenna then flees the building. 30 seconds later, shots began. So he enters the east stairwell. A student's going to use the washroom. He sees the student. He's loading his weapon. He tells him, "You better get out of here." Student ran out and was running around looking for help. At that point, nobody has been notified yet. At 2:22, he enters the hallway. The students in Dara Harris's English class, room 1216, have been broken into groups writing essays when the shooting starts. The smoke billowed in the hallway, moving into the rooms filled with terrified students and teachers. The smoke sets off the school's fire alarm. You may have heard that the fire alarm was pulled. It's not actually accurate. Within the first couple of days of the event, they were saying that the shooter came into the school, pulled the fire alarm, got everybody into the hallways and opened fire. What actually happened was, while he was engaging his weapon, smoke from the weapon activated the fire alarm. So he did not pull it. So he came in as per protocol, and we mentioned April 20th, 1999. In the last 20 years, there's been a lot put into school safety, and it's not for, it didn't go wasted because of actions learned and protocols. The doors were locked, doors were reinforced. At no point throughout this shooting did he enter a classroom. That's important to note. At no point did he ever enter a classroom. He shot through the windows of the door. Okay? Why is that? It's because of the safety and security protocols of having the doors locked at all times throughout the school. Could have been a lot worse. So he engages the first classroom. Obviously, now you have fire alarm going off. People hear loud noises. And in these situations, a lot of times, you know it's a gunshot, right? You think, wow, that sounds like a gunshot. But in your mind, you can't, wow, there's no way. It's got to be something else. There's got to be fireworks. And so there's this, in the military, you call it fog of war. You can imagine our high school kids, they don't know what's going on. Is it a fire drill? Maybe there was an explosion. Something's going on. So there's a lot of confusion. And he goes and he traverses up and down this hallway looking in classrooms. Most of the fatalities were in the hallway, students that were in the hallway, okay? The students in the first floor, Cruz's first stop, had little chance to hide. We find in active shooter scenarios, the first people to come in contact with the shooter, lowest rates of survival, obviously. But when you have protocols and mechanisms in place for getting the word out and acknowledging what's going on, and you have your safety and emergency procedures in place, it does save lives. So just like you see in most cases, the first people to come in contact them are the higher rated casualties. Cruz fires in the first floor classrooms and shoots others in the hallway, ultimately killing 11 on that floor. In her first story history class, social studies teacher Ivy Shamus was finishing a lesson on the Holocaust in room 1214. She then hears boom, 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 right outside the door. Bullets pierced the door's glass and hit 6 students, killing Helena Ramsey and Nicholas Stowart. Both were 17. He then fires into room 1213 where a psychology class is being held, killing students Carmen Shentrup and wounding several others. He makes his way through the first floor. School resource officer Scott Peterson, a Broward County deputy, rushes into a golf cart on the other side of campus and heads towards the 1200 building. So if you see on the map on the bottom right here, here's the northernmost building. He's essentially in the southeasternmost building on campus. Here's the gunshots, goes to his cart, and then he goes towards 1200 building. At this point, no notification has been made to police. Obviously, the fire alarm triggered, has notified the fire department to come to the scene.
We can hit enter. Just hit the enter button. Or the forward button.
Okay, I think that's what it was. All right. Okay, at 2:23, after McKenza runs from the building, he tells assistant football coach Aaron Feist about Cruz's gun. "Let me go check it out," Feist says. Feist became one of the casualties. As Cruz makes his way up to the building's second floor, Peterson reports over the radio, "I think we have shots fired, possible shots fired in the 1200 building." And you see that the SRO went from this building 1, and he's now stationed in between building 7 and 8, looking at building 12. As Cruz makes his way up to the building, Peterson stops at the corner of the building across from the 1200 building, where he remains for the entire shooting. At no point did he go forward or attempt to enter the building. Other deputies begin to arrive, but Peterson directs them to shut down traffic. They remain far from the 1200 building. So as deputies arrived on scene, they were not directed to go into the threat. They were directed to go stop traffic. So at this point, you have up to 5 Broward County Sheriff deputies on scene, an active shooter scenario, and nobody is entering the property. Nobody is going to address the incident. He goes up to the second floor, and part of the reason may have been because he goes up to the second floor, and as per security protocols, all the doors were closed. The alarm's going off. None of the students, because they heard the gunshots, evacuated their rooms on the second floor. There were 0 fatalities on the second floor. So not all these rooms were occupied, but the ones that were, as you see his pathway, he checks, and the teachers had gone to the doors and covered the doors as per their policy, so you can't see in. He did fire rounds through some of the glass, but because the students, as per protocol, went to the safe wall, so if you looked in, you couldn't see, he didn't see anybody. So he went from room to room to room looking for someone to shoot, and he didn't find anybody. There was a lot of students on that floor, okay? No fatalities on the second floor. They stay inside their classrooms despite the fire alarm, obviously because they heard the gunshots. He next heads to the third floor using the east stairwell, so he comes up on the west, goes through the floor, heads to the east stairwell, and he starts heading up. Students on the third floor, farther from the gunshots, make their way out of the classroom because of the fire alarm and start heading down the same stairwell where Cruz is walking up. So at that time, they see him walking up the stairs with the weapon, and then they retreat back onto the floor. The first one he encounters was a teacher who had opened up the door to allow the students to come back in. Once they got in, he was in the hallway, and he was shot. That was teacher Scott Beagle. Unlocks the door to room 1256. Students hide inside. Beagle is shot and killed outside the classroom. When Cruz turns his back to them, likely to reload his weapon, several race towards stairwell to escape. It's at 12:20, so this is 12:25. So he comes up, he engages here. At that point, he runs out of ammo. There's students on the floor here. They're running this way. They hid in this, trying to get in the rooms which were locked. Some of the teachers opened up the room, some would not. When he turns his back to reload, the rest of the students came down the stairwell. Outside, Sheriff's Deputy Michael Kratz shuts down traffic near West Glades Middle School. Just to the south of Stoneman Douglas, another deputy says he will shut down traffic moving west in front of the school. Why didn't they rush into the building? Possibly because of instructions over the radio from Peterson, the only deputy close enough to have confronted the gunman while shots were being fired. I hear shots by the football field, shots by the football field. Deputy Kratz reports over police radios. As Cruz approaches injured students, he moves west across the third floor. Some of the students locked out of the classroom are able to flee to the third floor as Cruz approaches, but the floor is soon filled with bullets, shells, glass, and blood. 6 people die on that floor. Get the school locked down, gentlemen, Peterson says over the police radios. Cruz moves towards the teacher's lounge at the west end of the floor. So this is 227. He enters the teacher's lounge, which is, there's nobody in there. It's locked. He shoots through the glass of the door, reaches in and opens the door, and he goes in there for 2 minutes. There's outside door, windows to the west and to the south. Now remember, the fire alarm went off, so the entire campus evacuated their buildings. So there's students leaving buildings all throughout campus because of the fire drill. So he aims out the south window and the west window, and he aims at targets that he sees. Well, because of the type of glass for the exterior of the building, it sharded the bullets and fragmented them, and nobody was shot. He sent 5 bullets to the south and 5 bullets to the west through the glass, and nobody was struck or killed by that. Cruz, so 5 rounds. The windows caused bullets to fragment. Now he remains in the teacher's lounge for up to 2 minutes. So 2 minutes, it's relative, right? I mean, if you wake up 2 minutes before your alarm, it seems like it's 30 seconds, right? But if you're waiting to get out of work and the 2 minutes seems like the clock's going slow, 2 minutes in this is a lifetime. So he's sitting there. At no point right now has law enforcement entered the building. Students are evacuating down the stairwell. He ditches his weapons in the teacher's lounge, walks the stairwell, and walks out to school with the other students who are evacuating. The first police officer and sheriff's deputies arrive and enter the building through the west doors, the same ones that Cruz left 5 minutes earlier. So 5 minutes after he left the building is the first time that law enforcement enters through the same door that he exited. Unaware that he's gone, they search for the gunman and pull victims of the building to waiting paramedics. They soon learned surveillance video showing him in the school was delayed, and that's what helped Cruz escape. So they went to the command center. They were viewing what they thought was real-time video, coming up with a strategy and how they thought he was locked in that teacher's lounge, so they were going to go in strategically, but it turned out that it was delayed. So that's why where you see the 5-minute delay where they didn't enter the building until then. Cruz walked to a Walmart. He enters the store, buys a drink on the interior subway. He then left on foot. At the same time, the first victim arrives at the local hospital. Cruz goes to a nearby McDonald's, sits down for a short time, and then leaves on foot. And then that's where he was identified via a BOLO alert. An officer identified him, and he was arrested. So the first, and that takes us, that was at 3:32, that leads us to 3:40, he was arrested. 5:39 was the first time that students and parents were able to get with the surviving students. So you can imagine in that 2-hour time frame, being a parent and waiting to hear news and not understanding, is your child alive or dead at a fusion center? So it was 2 hours before parents were able to meet back with their students. So just as administrators or school board members, think about in that scenario, what would you do in that case? Can you imagine the calls and the hysterics? And on top of that, you have an ongoing investigation, and they don't know if there's another shooter or there's more involved, and the confusion involved, which is why it's very important to have all these policies and procedures and protocols and training done ahead of time, so that if you do find yourself in this unfortunate situation, you can act in a proper way. The suspect analysis, if you look into his background, Obviously, a lot has come out since, and there's been a lot of investigation, and not a lot was known about him previously. There were a lot of instances, 24 times. So just let me go back a little bit. He was put up for adoption. He never met his birth mother. Shortly after being born, he was put up for adoption. Turns out his birth mother, still alive, she has a history with the police, 28 arrests. In 2010, she was arrested for beating someone with a tire iron. He has a half-sister from the same mother that he never met, who was also given up for adoption. In her life, she had 17 arrests. She's currently serving an 8-year prison sentence for second-degree attempted murder of a police officer. So, again, going into the investigation, they didn't know anything about this, the background of his natural parents. He was adopted by a family in the upper middle class suburban life. As he became into his teen years, there was a lot of issues. 24 times Broward County sheriffs were called, and you can look it up online. I won't get into all of them. There are currently at no point was he ever arrested. At no point was he ever put in the juvenile detention. They're all similar. They all revolve around violent activities, or at some point his mother thought he had run away from school. Him and his stepbrother had exited through a window. So again, there's just a litany of red flags here. There's 2 that are currently still under investigation. One was third-hand information received from neighbors that Nicholas Cruz planned to shoot up the school on Instagram. Pictures of a juvenile with guns. 1 month, time delay, unknown high school. Cruz lives in the area. That was not acted upon by local police. That is still under investigation as to what happened. The other one took place on November 30th, 2017. Now keep in mind, his adoptive mother died in November. You see an uptick in a lot of his activity and a lot of the concerns that were brought up after his stepmother passed away. But on November 30th, caller advised subject Nicholas Cruz is collecting guns and knives. Cruz wants to join the Army, concerned that he will kill himself one day and believes he could be a school shooter in the making. Caller advised Cruz was no longer living in the listed Parkland address and is now living in Lake Worth, Florida. He believes the weapons are kept at a friend's house at an unknown location. Deputies contacted the caller. Nothing else was progressed. That's currently under investigation by the FBI as far as what happened there. So that leads us into the red flags. This is some of the ones that should have spiked. He shot his neighbor's chickens. Pointed a gun at his half-brother they were fighting over who would get Nutella, a jar of Nutella. He held an AR-15 to his mother's head because he was angry because she took his Xbox away. And then he moved in shortly after his mother was passed. He moved into a family and friend's house, and he was kicked out when he grabbed the brother, or the son of the people he moved in with, and held him to the ground and started fighting with him. They kicked him out of the house. That was shortly before the school shooting. So you see just a ton of red flags, and it's unfortunate that they weren't able to connect the dots. Again, without knowing the psychological effects, or understanding what his birth mother was, I don't know how you would put that all together. In hindsight, it's a lot easier, but certainly there seems that there should have been enough there to take further action, or at least separate him from his weapons, or get him some help. Similarities with other school shooters. He wasn't a loner. A lot of times you hear like these kids are loners. He wasn't necessarily a loner. He didn't have a lot of friends. He had a small group of friends who considered him pretty good guy. I mean, they hung out. There was no real issues with his small group, but by no means his small group of friends were kind of outcasts. So you have the outcast aspect of it. Some people who weren't his friends considered him kind of a weird guy, but just let him go in passing. There's not a lot of knowledge here if there was any bullying. I know that's a common thread that you see in a lot of these things. This wasn't really the case here. And a lot of family discord. Obviously, he didn't know his birth parents. He was told at a later time, essentially, I don't know, coincidentally or causally, is when he started acting up. And when he was doing the interrogation afterwards, he had mentioned that he wasn't told about his being adopted until a later time, and that upset him. So could be something there. And he was also on anti-anxiety drugs, and had recently taken the alcohol, drinking a lot of wine and whatnot. So lessons learned. Law enforcement changes, as I'm sure everybody's aware of, and I'm not looking to get into the debate, but gun control laws, over 50 gun control laws have been enacted since February. Pretty much if you look at the rundown and the background and you talk about either mental illness or family discord or antidepressant use, a lot of part of what led to this, a lot of that hasn't been addressed yet. Those are more hot button issues, and it's harder to get in and find out, when you talk about privacy laws and as school administrators or board members, at what point when you have a teenager who's acting in a certain way, does it raise a flag to where you're going to enact some sort of service or help, or do you need the parents? Yes.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
This is just about from a law enforcement changes. You mentioned earlier how the suspect wasn't, there was no signal anything about to take to the juvenile facility.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know how it is down there, but in Illinois, it's a lot child that's got all those red flags that are screaming at you that this is a problem. If you don't deal with it or get him where he needs to go for something detained or whatever, you're going to have a bigger problem. So like I know in Illinois, it's a little harder for us to do that because of that reason, because the juvenile laws were written in 1987. So do you foresee any changes statewide and nationwide where they're going to maybe re-look at some juvenile laws and try to realize that we need to have a little more law enforcement and judicial needs to have a little more of a hammer to curtail this, and then basically show this is not going to be allowed and this is what's going to happen. Do you see anything like that changing?
So I'm chair of the the Public-Private Committee for Illinois Chiefs of Police, and the one thing we talk about, the first and foremost thing that we're talking about to try to reform is the mental health issue. Because what the law enforcement is seeing is, let's say they go to a call on a regular domestic, and I'm not even going to put the juvenile aspect up because that elevates it to a whole nother level, right? So just on a regular domestic, if they identify maybe someone has some mental health issues and hasn't committed a crime, well, law enforcement really doesn't have any avenues. And it comes down to resources. It comes down to, do they bring them to the hospital? And the hospitals are saying, we don't have beds for this. We have other patients that have physical ailments. There really is a lack of that within the country and within the state. And it boils down to resources and process. And certainly privacy laws come into effect. You have children who may be living with other relatives. There's so many complicating factors in that. Certainly, I think it needs to be addressed, though, and that's, I think, where some of the focus needs to be is that, here we are, we've enacted 50 gun control laws, but yet where are we making progress in identifying what do we do when we find a kid who's in this type of situation, who has all these red flags, who's taking that next, now, after the fact, we have all this information. We know about his birth mother. We know about his birth stepsister. There was nothing in that process legally, and there was nobody who had the responsibility to identify that history until after the incident.
So just on this Tuesday at the commission, there were 2 students that gave testimony saying that they actually went to the administration, to administrators specifically, and reported some of the behavior and some of the reports of Nicholas Cruz. They claim the administration did not investigate it. Of course, the administration is saying they were not aware of it and that this did not happen. But again, I think it speaks to our board members or administrators that don't dismiss any type of reports that are coming in. Things need to be properly investigated and vetted out. And in this case, while maybe law enforcement did not know any history of behavior of the student, there must have been some type of behavior of the student in the school district that led to his expulsion.
Yeah, certainly mental health was an issue here. The process to fix that is an issue, and that needs to be addressed. Other things, SRO policy, first man enters, that came right after Columbine, didn't happen here. Inexcusable on any level. If you ask me personally, privately, I'll tell you the same thing. My relationship with the law enforcement, everybody I talk to says the same thing. School safety improvements, we'll talk about some building and some emergency stuff that need to be thought of when you're building a property, and it certainly need to be assessed for older school buildings. The technology is there, the opportunities are there, you need to look at that. And then finally, community awareness, back to the mental health thing. His neighbors reported multiple times he was outside with guns. See something, say something, stay alert, stay alive, take care of each other, take care of your neighbors. It all plays into it, so we'll stop right there.
This one.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for, as Paul said, for taking the time and letting us share a couple of thoughts and experiences, if you will. And I come from a perspective, we all have different perspectives up here, but I, like the fire chiefs in your community, the experiences that we have, we come from a little bit of a different perspective. We might be in that school at midnight, we might be there tomorrow, we might be there this afternoon, etc. And I have had the chance 16, 17 years ago to work in the incident command post for 23, 24 people shot in a bar in Elgin with somebody killed as well. And so never did I think at that time that it would parlay, if you will, in our society to what we're experiencing today. I do not envy you. This is the stuff that keeps people up at night, and there are some real challenges ahead for all of us. There's no doubt about that. I have 4 simple slides, a couple of discussion or emphasis points on them. In this here, I just want to emphasize that there has been a tremendous amount of success in our country, in your schools, in your districts, in your communities, of things like the codes and the alarm systems, the design and construction. They're going to talk about that some more. But I think a starting point is recognizing that we've had success to threats, if you will, to building fires. You go back X number of years, decades, that was the threat. And effectively that was addressed through a multitude of means, including yourself. But there's a starting point of some success there. And maybe there's an element of that is what gets us to that next thing. I think that the addressing of the issue potentially of what's hitting us now is going to tie into this in some way. Do we adjust what we currently have? We have to do something different, obviously. But that history is there for decades, but now we're at that point. So as I'm sure you're aware, there is a lot of dialogue. Well, before I touch that, we have become very effective in all of our schools through a partnership to when that fire alarm goes off. I use the term rats. We're trained like rats, correct? We post in every room. We diagram the path to get out. We talk about a meeting place. We would even have in some schools and districts, maybe not so much anymore, cards we'd hold up to say if the whole class was there. A variety of factors, but we became very effective in responding to that fire alarm system, correct? And that's a good thing. We have to be careful now as we move into the new threat that's on the table that's attacking us, to completely throw that out, but integrate that somehow into how do we respond. What if that shooter has pulled the fire alarm? What if in some cases that one of the kids that is running out pulls the fire alarm, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to offer that there is no black and white on that. There is no, there's a significant amount of gray area in there, all right? There is discussion, recommendations from the Illinois Terrorism Task Force in regards to a 3-minute delay before they would evacuate. Maybe a consideration with that, and many fire chiefs have concern about that. Right or wrong, doesn't really matter. A suggestion to maybe consider is this integration or this pausing at spots as they are exiting, maybe from a classroom to the exit of the building. Maybe there's 4 or 5 spots total where there's a transition, if you will. And maybe we begin to talk about transition pauses for 5 seconds. So it's kind of like a slinky of checking, and not just running out into that hallway, but looking at those transition points at some point. When we talk about the run, hide, fight in a second, in some cases it's going to be appropriate for that teacher and those students to run. And in some cases it's going to be to hide. But when they choose to run, is there a transition at this hallway, at this stairwell, at this next door, etc.? And that's something that we need to be in that discussion. I mean, should there be that delay? There are many people that will argue that if there is a delay, it's just going to give the shooter or the shooters more time to make it to that building, to that hallway, to that stairwell, to that level of the building, to find more people to create victims. You've heard the run, hide, fight. This is where I get very passionate in regards to the responsibility for training. Run, hide, fight, having a plan and having options. I believe the perspective is to allow that teacher to have as much authority to make that decision whether they run, hide, or fight. All right, that's pretty much, I think, the philosophy that this panel would have is we can't set that teacher must do this first, teacher must do this second, etc. There has to be some decision-making authority. In that situation, though, if there is not a significant amount of cultural understanding in that school, cultural support from the superintendents all the way through the teachers, through the labor groups, etc., etc. Doesn't matter if it's a big school, small school. If there is not a significant amount of partnership with the local fire department, the local police department, if that's not there, then we cannot have the expectation that there's going to be a successful event. All right? Maybe by luck, but we don't want to leave it to that. The specific, I hear a lot of people from different schools and school districts will say, well, we're going to focus this. The perspective of a big school and a small school, a well-funded school by their community and a not so well-funded school, a school where the police station might be 1 minute down the road, and a school where it might take 20 minutes for a county sheriff to reach that school. Those things are going to impact the decisions by that teacher, right? And so I think where you stand depends on where you sit. So, but that's a challenging thing. That's a really challenging thing. Not telling you anything that you don't know. And this training of staff, I will say it as loud as I can, that is the most critical piece. With all the challenges, and when Paul was speaking, I feel it, I'm sure you feel it, the questions were asked, well, what about all these other things? You're right, all those other things are still there. And probably all those other things are still going to be there in some capacity, in some amount or some volume. We still got to figure out a way to do what we can and to make some inroads here and to prevent some of this. Most critical piece, I believe, and you've seen the videos, you've seen the different university or schools that are showing the videos, the most critical piece is the training. You will, as educators or people that watch over educators and lead educators, if they're not doing the hands-on training repetitively, and then you bring a crisis situation on, there's no way that training will have any effect. You'll have no traction in that. I can train firefighters all day long in the classroom, and I can talk about it, but until we get into an area where we're actually hands-on with stuff, and then we introduce smoke, and then we introduce heat, and then we introduce time, then I start to see performance slipping. And that's where we need to be at. If we're not getting it as close to reality as we can, then we're not gonna really get the traction in the training. And that's how I would define if you're getting that success. You have to get it to where you're seeing that slip in that performance to where now you're at that spot. All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to talk a little bit about the architectural and design components of this. As mentioned earlier, I'm also involved with the intruder alert systems as well that John will talk about. But we're going to hit some of the big ideas. In the interest of time, I'm going to move fairly quickly. I'm not going to read everything on the slide. But you'll see in these images that there's a lot of glass in these buildings. Some of the big picture things when you're designing a facility, and I've been doing it for 30 years, is the placement of this facility. As you saw in Parkland, that was a multi-building campus. We have a number of school districts, Burlington Central is an example, that has multiple buildings on a given campus. So placement of the building, access to those buildings, the site circulation, around there, not only for buses and students, but for emergency vehicles. How are they going to stage if and when there's an event, whether it's an active shooter event or another type of emergency that would be in your emergency operations plan. Material selections. So again, you see glass, as an architect, we love glass. We love seeing lots of glass and in unique shapes and forms and curves. But in the reality of things, we have a budget to work with and we need to make the building secure first. So targeting areas of glass that are appropriate, allowing glass into classrooms so that you have natural daylighting is a good thing. Do they need to be a full wall of glass? Not necessarily. As you see in the image on the right, lower right, that's a beautiful space, but that's a corridor with glass on each side, spaces on each side. So if there is an assailant in that facility, they can shoot through any of those areas, and in some cases, completely through the building. So we need to balance the idea of a really cool, innovative design with the safety and security of the students. And the architect should be doing that, the engineers should be doing that, as should be the administrators and board, to try and balance what is comfortable for their community. And then providing adequate shelter options. A very important piece. Illinois is one of the few, if not only, states that has a tornado shelter requirement. That law went into effect very recently in the last couple of years, that there is a certain amount of a level of construction that has to be provided in any new school facility or any addition over a certain size to allow for what was intended to be a tornado shelter or a severe weather shelter. That certainly can also be used in that run, hide, fight scenario. It can also be created as a safe room for all or a majority of staff or students. And that should be incorporated into your design as you're going through that process. So intrusive active shooter information. Secure entrances, we all know that. There are still a number of schools that do not have them. They were designed with their offices not at the front door, but remotely in the building. Those need to be addressed, and there should be a single point of entry. We talk to the teachers and staff about not propping open doors as often as possible, but even at our own high school in Sycamore, we were last year allowing students to come in at about 3 different points. That no longer is the case, and that decision was driven by the students, saying, hey, you know, maybe we should only have 1 point of entry and everyone should be accounted for when they come in. And we're willing to get here a little bit earlier because we know it's going to take longer for us all to get through that one entry point. And they drove that decision. They came to our board and said, this is the way we want to do it. Access control systems, being able to track and know who is coming and going from your building, at least from a staff standpoint, especially in after hours. Our majority of us have schools that are used as community facilities throughout the entire day. For different organizations, and being able to track who is coming and going, not so much for who left the mess behind, but is someone in there that maybe left something behind for an event that's going to happen tomorrow. We need to be prepared for that. Door hardware, electric strikes, and staff monitoring. We should all be doing that visitor management program of some type, checking student IDs at a minimum, making sure that every visitor, whether you're a board member or an administrator, you sign in, period. We want a record of everybody that's coming in and out. You don't get a pass. You have to sign in, or you're tracked, or you're scanned. And finally, video monitoring and camera systems. Again, many of us have that. If you're not aware, your tort funds can be used for safety and security. So if you have an excess in your tort fund, you can upgrade your cameras, upgrade video monitoring systems, those types of things. There is no point in doing pan and tilt cameras unless you have a security person that's actually going to be sitting there watching it 24/7. So be judicious in what you choose, and choose higher pixel quality as opposed to quantity sometimes, because the information that you do get is valuable unless it's so blurry you can't make it out. Other things that are important in the material side of things, again, those entries tend to be a lot of glass, a lot of visual. You want to have a connection. Every district is a little different. Some want a little more substantial. We have a pass-through window, and that's where you check in. Others want it to be more wide open. The one thing I would suggest is what's going to stop an assailant, whether they're a student or someone else, from driving right through your front doors. Just aluminum and glass. So as you see in the lower left corner, you can still have plenty of glass but have a masonry base. You can also put bollards out in front of the building that stop that from happening. That doesn't create such an adverse or negative prison-like effect. It's just an effective way to protect them from someone bringing a vehicle in and then working throughout the building in that particular area. Protective films do exist. They do not stop any bullets that I'm aware of. They will slow down or fragment some. The larger caliber, they do not stop them yet. That technology will continue to advance, but it is not there yet. Still recommended to use those in targeted areas. As a budget standpoint, you cannot afford to put bullet-resistant glass in every window, every area of your building. But if you want to target certain areas and spend the money wisely and use protective films in secondary areas, that would be advisable. Law enforcement alert system, I will let John talk about that in a little bit. Building notification, that's tied in, but I would also suggest spending some dollars on your intercom system and or your voice over IP to make sure it functions well and people can hear things, because communication is key when you're training and or when you're having any kind of event, whether it's an active intruder situation or a hazardous material spill. You need to be able to communicate. Everybody needs to be able to hear. Numbered exterior doors, not only for staff but for emergency responders. That's starting to become more commonplace, and older facilities are starting to add those numbers in. I would not suggest putting classroom numbers on outside windows like classroom 102, 103, 104, because that actually creates the environment where someone can target that, because I know Mrs. Smith, who I don't like, teaches in classroom 102. So numbering doors and exit ways, yes, probably not numbering spaces and giving room areas. And situational awareness, Paul touched on that. That's very important. I'm going to touch very quickly on hazardous. The reason I say that is that you should be using this in your emergency operations plan as well. But when you're doing that, think about every time these events happen, they get a little more sophisticated, a little more sophisticated. And one of those things is, why don't I do something in science class that might injure some students if that's my goal? Or what if I were to create something, I go on the internet and I can go get some chemicals at a lot of different places. I can create something that'll also create havoc in the school, take out some students or staff, and also act as a diversion for me to go do something else. So you have to think about these unfortunately in different scenarios, and providing things like segregated HVAC so you can shut down systems in the building. Most new systems now operate off of remote control, iPad or a laptop somewhere, so you can be remote and shut down areas. Your buildings require a certain amount of ventilation. Looking at enhancing that in areas that might be targeted for these types of things, larger gathering spaces, commons, theaters, gymnasiums. When you're designing the buildings, design for appropriate evacuation. Meeting code is one thing, but planning the building appropriately so students can get out even faster or quicker, as opposed to what the minimum, code is a minimum requirement. Going beyond that sometimes makes sense, and also that shelter in place area. So let's talk about real quickly your emergency operations plans. You all should have one. They should not be a huge binder sitting on the superintendent's shelf that no one ever looks at. They should be more accessible. They should be visual for even volunteers in your building, flip chart type approach, so that their guidelines still giving that person, that staff member, that teacher flexibility to act appropriately based on the situation. There's some key components. The first thing is obviously prevention, being proactive about trying to identify those red flags. Providing protection, which we just kind of talked about. How do you design facilities or enhance your existing facilities to allow for that protection? What mitigation can you do to save life and loss? We'll talk about some systems that can be integrated into the building. How are you responding? That's part of this plan. How do you stabilize the situation? How do you communicate, provide a secure environment? And then a recovery if an event were to happen. How'd that take place? These are some basic components. I'm not going to go through each of them. Again, highlighting the training and exercises part and the organizational responsibilities, who's doing what and when, and training that over and over again. And we'll go to the last one here. Some of the basic plan components, there's a number of what we call functional annexes. These are areas of evacuation and lockdown. How do you shelter in place? Reunification is a big piece. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And recovery if there is an event. And then the security, mental, and follow-up mental health for your staff and your students all has to be part of the emergency operations plan. It's not just about what happens in the moment of the event. It's all the follow-up that has to come, and that takes an immense amount of time beyond the actual event, which may only take a matter of minutes. Threats and hazards specific to those annexes, we know what those are. They're natural, they're technological now. Hacking is becoming much more prevalent. If I were a student that wanted to get back, the first thing I would want to do is take out your internet and take out your power, because then I have more control over what I may or may not want to do in that building. The second thing I would want to do is I would want to have a partner or two that's placed in your building, which goes to what was voted on at the delegate assembly today, with regards to arming teachers and staff. That failed by a vote of 203 to 179. Right now, I know it's a debate on local control, but I know that students are capable of overpowering a teacher if they have a weapon and they're not trained frequently on using it. Let the law enforcement people have the training, let them do that job. Teachers are there to teach, administrators are there to lead. They don't need to be providing that. That's my personal opinion, but that can happen, and that's what students are now thinking about, and they're more savvy at it than we think they are. And then there's obviously the other threats that come from adversarial. And then there are a number of drills. You know, we do a number of drills. Since we've instituted fire alarms and the Holy Angel Fire and all those things, no student has died in a school fire in the country. Zero, none. That's because we have codes, have design measures, and we train for it over and over. Three drills, one with fire. You're also required to have a severe weather shelter drill and a bus evacuation drill, and then as of 2013, the one active shooter. I would argue one is not enough. I would suggest that you consider doing a second active shooter one, and that you also do a reunification drill so they understand what's going to happen after those critical minutes of the event, both the parents and the community as well as the students and the staff. With that, I'm going to let John take over on some of the alert systems.
Thank you, and move through this quickly, hopefully leave a minute for questions.
We'll stick around, too.
Yeah, and we'll stick around afterwards, so there's a lot of content here. So the need for this discussion is obviously known. We've reached a point in our society where this issue has become a prevalent discussion point and concern, both in schools, but also in private industry, churches, et cetera. As Steve alluded to, there has not been a loss of life in a school fire since 1958 in the United States. And the reason for that is we've done, as a society, a great job at mitigating, putting the systems and the training in place to prevent that from happening. Not to say it can't happen, but we've done a great job with building codes, with alarms, with sprinkler systems, with training, with drilling that training frequently. We've done a great job. Unfortunately, we're at a state today where, as unlikely as it is for a school shooting to happen, which is unlikely, it's not, you know, it's a fear that we have, but it's unlikely, it's still far more likely than it will be to have a fire in one of our facilities as a school. So this slide just kind of shows some statistics of what's taking place around the country just in this year, which is horrifying, quite honestly. Really quickly, the reason I'm standing up here is my background is construction. I built a lot of schools for Todd, along with Steve as the architect. We're the builders. In 2012, right after Sandy Hook, had no concept of what we were about to step into. Todd, Dr. Stern said to Steve and I, John, every building has a fire alarm. Why don't we do that for police? And to be honest with you, that was an aha moment, because all of a sudden the light bulb went off. We have a serious issue with active shooters, with emergency situations in schools. The number one issue we have is communication. I absolutely believe that. The communication outbound to get law enforcement, to get help coming, the communication within the facility to notify everyone who's in danger that you're in danger. Now's the time to lock down. As Paul mentioned, in the school, thankfully people were able to get behind glass locked doors. There were still some deaths there, but the people who are on the open are really at risk. So communicating with those folks. And then communicating during and after an event. How do we let people know in a secure manner what's taking place? We all know as soon as an event happens at a school, Facebook lights up, Twitter lights up, all those things that I don't use light up. But the information that's out there is just random. And you can't rely on that information. So we need a secure way to communicate to students, to teachers, to parents, to law enforcement, to fire responders, all of those folks. Critical to do, as well as that first notification. When something happens, what are we going to do? Who's supposed to call the police? Who's supposed to let the principal know? Who's going to call the superintendent? Who's going to get on the PA? All of those things take time. And we found in Sandy Hook that the system broke down and it didn't happen. 5 minutes before a phone call left that building to police. The building was never really notified via PA or announcement that something was going on. Parkland, same thing. That poor young man who encountered the shooter who walked in, and the shooter said, "Get out of here." He ran. and he just looked for somebody to tell. But he found a gym coach, and the gym coach said, well, I'll go check it out. There's a better way, and there's methods out there to help. Here's some of the methods that are out there. You know, there are push buttons you can see around districts or, you know, around facilities. You know, the under desk panic button, lots of different things. Apps for your cell phone. What's missing in a lot of these systems that we believe, number one, is a supervision of the system. Supervision means, is that system being constantly checked to be sure it's going to work? I walk into so many buildings, not so much schools, sometimes schools, but other facilities, and they'll say, well, we've got a panic button underneath the desk of the secretary or the receptionist. When was the last time you tested it? Oh, I don't know. Does it work? I don't know. What does it do? I don't know. They don't know. And it's not supervised. You go and test it, and it doesn't work. So it needs to be supervised. Everything you do needs to look like your fire alarm, in that system is checking in and telling you, okay, I'm good. I got a low battery. I got a communication error. All of those things are happening constantly. Redundant. You don't want to have just one option. If something fails, you've got to have a redundant option via power or via communication. We mentioned monitored. It has to be area-wide. You know, some places will say, well, I've got one button at the front office. Well, it's better than nothing, but what happens if that front office isn't where the incident starts? How are you going to notify police? How are you going to notify people and tell them what's happening and where it's happening? What we call it as a life safety design is very critical. And the idea is, we've done this already for fire. Let's build on that. We can do more, but let's use that same standard, that this is life safety. This is something that's going to work, guaranteed to work when it's needed. So critical things are, when a system is set off, you need to be sure that dispatch is called with exact location of the incident, where it's taking place, to allow for that rapid response. We need to make sure that the building occupants are notified. That can be multiple redundancies. Steve mentioned PA systems. Make sure your PA systems are functioning well. Make sure that they have good message repeaters on them that can be used and triggered automatically, and not have to have someone get to a microphone and make an announcement. Use some strobes, use text messaging, use voice calls. Anything you can leverage to communicate, you want to leverage to communicate. And then when you're doing that, you want to communicate as much information as you can. As Paul talked about, and as we talked about, we need to empower the people who may be involved in these situations to make good decisions for themselves, because it's not like a fire alarm anymore. Fire alarm is, you pull the alarm, you get out of the building. If something like this, an active shooter, God forbid, happens, it doesn't necessarily mean I get out of the building. It means I need to know what other information can I gather to make the right decision for my next move, as Chief Felice mentioned. Informed decisions. And all that information also should be gotten to police and to responders immediately, so they can start seeing what information there is. I'm going to move past that one. Best thing that you can find is something that leverages the existing systems you have. We mentioned PA systems, camera systems. Everybody has cameras. Not everybody, almost everybody has cameras, and really cool cameras. That's awesome. Cameras usually will help you figure out what happened after the fact. Find a system that can help you leverage the power of getting eyes into a situation while it's happening. And law enforcement can be sent that information automatically. They can pick up on their phone and see what's taking place on your cameras with as easy as a text. Unfortunate situation at Parkland. Police were looking at cameras. We fed information from cameras they thought were live. They were not live. They were a 20-minute delay, I believe, Paul. Is that correct? So that they're searching a building. They're searching for a gunman, and they're told he's on the second floor. He should be right in front of you. He's not here. There's nobody here. After the fact, there was a 20-minute delay on cameras. Get live video camera feed if you can. Just a couple of quick, brief questions on cost. You know, we talk about budgets are tight, and I get it. You know, I'm a taxpayer too. I get it. And we've done a great job with fire. And comparatively, you could get a fire alarm sprinkler system in your building is probably going to be $3 to $4 a square foot of cost. A fire alarm system, the pull down, strobes, all that stuff, is going to be $250 to $350 a square foot. You know, a burglar intrusion system, something that tells you when the glass is broken, when a door's open that it shouldn't be, you know, is going to be $1 a square foot. You can get a good notification and alert system for, on the lower end of that scale, of all that scale. So look at it, see what's out there. Training we've talked about, so I don't know if we need to talk about that so much. Who is going to do the?
You were talking to
You can go ahead if you want,
All
or
right.
you want me to take it?
No, why don't you take it? Why don't you take it? We'll wrap up here, and then we'll stick around for questions.
Yep.
So, as boards of education administrators, we're all committed to student safety. We all have plans, but are those plans being reviewed? Are they agile? Any plan has to be agile. As it was mentioned earlier, most of these situations are not black and white, but there contains a lot of gray. And rather than having extensive plans sitting on a shelf, the most important thing you can do is train, 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 and build agility in your students and your staff and in your visitors. So you train and you drill, train and drill. Alert, you have to have your communication channels open. Anyone in the military would tell you that everything stems and flows from comm. And if you lose your comm, you're functioning in the dark. So you have to have a good system, not only for alert, but just as important is that communication system. And then empowering your people to act through their training and through their drills, and that's what makes the difference. We'll take some questions at this time, if I know we're at the time, but be happy to take a question. Yes?
Real quick, I'm from the Nutter Pool one, we just been blessed with our second failed referendum, and we're gonna have to get some trailers. I am scared to death, I'm a board member, scared to death to approve a trailer in my district, because you said at Parkland, he shot through the window. You ever see a trailer? You can shoot through a trailer the same way. I could put 3 police officers around that trailer, and those kids still aren't safe. Got some advice for me?
I'll challenge that to their architect and construction person.
Yeah, come on.
Sorry, is that live? There we go. There we go. Don't put trailers in first. That would be something to avoid. Yeah, that really limits you. We have clients as well that we service that have had to do similar things for growth options until they've been able to pass a referendum or find another funding source for those areas. It's very challenging. They do make some Kevlar panels. They are very, very expensive, and we've used them in police stations and in secure entrances around the entry desk and those functions. That's something that could be added to the building if you really feel that that's something that's likely. How you place them so that they are in a visible location. I know they're not attractive, believe me, but that they're not tucked around the back side of the building where no one's going to monitor them, no one's going to see what's going on. That invites people to come by. Those are 2 things that I would come up with. You have anything, John?
No, that's just a tough one. I mean, by nature, those things are meant to be temporary.
Yeah.
They're not enduring structures, so it's really hard to fortify something that was built from the beginning to be mobile.
You're going to be required to have fire alarm connection in there, and you should have communication connection in there as well. And if you have an intruder alert system of any type, they should also be connected, absolutely, so they can communicate back and forth.
So I'm 100% correct in saying I'm scared to death.
In today's society, you are accurate, yes.
That is accurate.
Yep.
I'm sorry for your situation.